Hi, Dr. Robert Pyle. Thank you so much. This is such an honor.
Thank you, Tina.
I am
Thank you,
so glad
Veronica.
we could see you. We could hear you.
I'm glad too. We've been through quite a bit to get here. And I see Bruce, I see John, I see Dave. I see another Bruce.
Yes, there's a couple of people coming in, but
And
I can just do a
Guest
quick
and
intro. So
Suzanne.
thank you so much for helping us kick off this book club. And
pleasure.
I'm going to pass it to Veronica. Veronica is our director of community for Travonde, and she will be your moderator interviewing Dr. Robert Pyle.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Thanks, Tina. And thank you everyone for coming. I'm thrilled to have you join us today. And I would like to say that the mission of this book club is to share and celebrate our love of literacy and many wonderful writers with each other. With that being said, I am delighted and honored to introduce our first guest, Dr. Robert Michael Pyle. He is internationally acclaimed author, scholar, lecturer, and biologist. He has published hundreds of articles, essays, peer-reviewed scientific papers, poems, and 24 books. He has received a long list of awards, medals, honors for his work, including the John Burroughs Medal, the Guggenheim Fellowship, Pacific Northwest Booksellers Award, Washington Writers Awards, and National Outdoor Book Awards. And some of his other notable important accomplishments include Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation, which he founded in 1971. And as some of you may know, his book, Where Bigfoot Walks, has been adapted for a feature film, The Dark Divide, starring Deborah Messing and David Cross, currently streaming on video on demand. And this film was also featured in our November Zoom Day, as many of you may know. And I will need a lot more time to properly introduce Dr. Pyle, but since I want to give him as much time as possible to speak, I will just dive right into the questions and get to know him in person without further ado. So Dr. Pyle, thank you for joining us today.
It's my great pleasure, Veronica. Thank you for having me.
Good. I would like to ask you, what does your typical day look like?
Now or before?
Both.
Actually, it hasn't changed that much. As many of you will know, writing is a largely solitary activity. Mm-hmm. And more so since I lost my wife 6 years ago, 7 years ago last month. I've been on my own, and my pussycat was my primary co-participant, co-conspirator, but my pussycat ran off to join the coyotes a couple of months ago. Oh. So it's really me and the trees and the slugs and so on. So living on one's own, one doesn't have other person's expectations to meet, which means you usually fall into your very worst habits. And my worst habits are actually, if anything, probably reinforced by the plague, as I suppose many of ours are. Not necessarily worst, I don't really mean worst habits. I mean, we indulge ourselves with the way that our clock wants to work and the way that our intentions want to work. We don't necessarily have the opportunity to be with others now. We don't, but we also don't have their expectations to meet quite so much. So I find that my typical day is not all that different from what it used to be, except I have less help getting up in the morning. And I'm not really a morning person. A lot of writers said they get most of their writing done, you know, at 3 in the morning or 6 in the morning, not me. Where I live in the Pacific Northwest rainforest, it's kind of chilly. It's not cold, but it's kind of chilly and dank at this time of year much of the time. And so it feels really good to be in bed. And so what I tend to do is I squeeze out of bed as early as I can, 9, sometimes not even 10 these days, and go downstairs and make myself a proper breakfast. Then I bring it back upstairs and I have it in bed, and I read. I find that as a writer and as a person, and I'm sure you all find that too, or you wouldn't be in a book club, that reading is a very important part of life. And that's going to be something of a theme of our talk today. So I read. That's one of the times that I make sure I read every day, unless I have something else I have to do. Before I try to write, before I try to communicate much, I read. I try not to get locked into email before I go back upstairs. Otherwise, I can
True.
make it lunch instead of breakfast. So I read for maybe an hour with breakfast, and then get up, do what has to be done with the essential emails, and so on. And then I tend to go to work in the afternoon. The afternoon tends to be my most productive time, whether it is sorting and archiving and filing, those kinds of pedestrian things, or the actual creative act of writing or editing or rewriting. All that tends to happen in the afternoon. And it used to be when I did have a life partner living with me, that I would try not to work at night. And I'd always try to be present in the evening in front of the fire, reading, listening to music, dining in, and so on. And now I tend to pause to make myself a proper dinner and have it sitting down, reading a book, a different book at the dining room table, just to give a little structure. And then I usually go back to work at night again. And I'll often work till about midnight or 1. And then I go to bed and I read for another hour or 3 minutes until I fall asleep. So it's a kind of a dull day, really.
A lot
No,
of
I didn't say
reading.
anything about getting outside, but sometime in there, I always get outside a little bit, whether it's just down to the mailbox or a more ambitious walk.
Great. Great. Breakfast is always important,
Yeah.
and the most important meal of the day, so they say.
I think
And
so. Yes.
yeah. So what are you currently reading, if you don't mind sharing with the club?
I see a friendly face looming in.
My
Hi,
son,
Ben.
say hi.
Howdy.
Mommy's zooming
Good.
like you do in the morning. Sorry.
Well, I'm currently reading the latest, and I'm afraid last book by Barry Lopez, who's one of our greatest, people say nature writer, and I'm called that too, but I don't mind that term. It seems to designate a kind of a genre. Some people think it's kind of a lesser genre, nature writing, but when you think about it, and you think of anything that's not part of nature, I can't. I've taught environmental writing at universities, and I've come to think that the terms environmental writing and nature writing are redundant terms. They're synonyms for writing. They simply tend to designate writing that takes in a little more of the rest of the world. Our neighbors, our other species, our cohabitants, our relatives beyond the human skin, as well as the human. So Barry is certainly a person who's written a good deal about the so-called natural world, the world that is more than the human world. But he's also one of the great natural philosophers, one of the great thinkers of our time. Barry Lopez won the Burroughs Medal of Wolves and Men, won the National Book Award for Arctic Dreams. And Barry, I'm afraid, is mortally ill right now. Not with the plague, but with a long-standing illness. I wrote to him just 3 days ago. But I'm reading his masterwork now that he worked on for many years, called Horizon.
Horizon. I'll remember it.
And I just finished the final book. I mean, these sound depressing, reading these final books, but you know, it's a manifest. It's a manifesto. These are what we leave behind, and they're gifts for always. They're always living. That's the great thing about books. By Brian Doyle, another wonderful Northwest writer from Portland, very well known as just a superb essayist, extremely highly regarded, but also a novelist. And Brian's very last book was put together by David James Duncan and Katie Yale. It was his last bunch of essays that had not been collected, and a brilliant book again. So I just read that, and now I'm reading Barry. But I always read a novel or two at the same time. Upstairs, I tend to read fiction. I read a lot of. I didn't used to read mysteries, but my present girlfriend got me onto that. She reads a lot of, and my sister too, very good mysteries. You know, there's a lot of good writing in that field. So I'm just finishing a big Elizabeth George, and I like the Nordic, especially the Icelandic mysteries by Erlendur and others, but not the super violent ones. So I read all kinds of things, and I did read last year between March and November. I had challenged myself for a long time to read my grandmother's volume of the collected Shakespeare, the complete Shakespeare.
Wow.
And I read it. I read it March to November and
Wow.
had a real good time.
Great. Well, your reading, passion in reading shows in your writing. I enjoy very much the Nature Matrix. And from reading your collection of essays, Nature Matrix, I felt the passion and the care that you have towards our natural world. And how and where did you find your passion and inspiration to become the lepidopterist and a biologist? And what kept you going to become an expert in the field?
Well, I'm always dubious of that term, of course, but I guess we're all naturalists, all of us who engage with anything beyond our skins to some degree or another. But then there are those who really feel compelled to pay a lot of attention to other animals and to plants and to the physical world around us. And I don't exclude the human-built world in that, by the way, as I said. And that came very, very early for me. My first memory of it is being out in the garden in Denver, North Denver, where I was born, with my mother in the garden. And she was weeding an early spring garden. I think violets were already blooming, as I recall. And she picked up a little silken object. And she said, "Bobby, this is a cocoon. I think something beautiful is going to come out of it."
Mm-hmm.
And years later, of course, I discovered what would come out of it. But that really caught my imagination. For some reason, spiders scared me when I was little, and I became a terrible arachnophobe, which was not conducive to being a young naturalist. And I had to fight that for a long time, finally overcame it. But it wasn't butterflies at first. Even though I lived in Colorado, my first great natural history passion at the age of 7 was for seashells. And let me tell you, Colorado is a dumb place to be a young conchologist. It really is. I spent all my allowance at the museum buying shells, and I belonged to a Shell of the Month club. I really did. I'd get some fancy volute or Murex in the mail every month. And but it was diminishing returns, you know. It was an unrequited love. I couldn't even find any land snails, though I tried and tried and tried, and I was crazy about them, couldn't find them. And once I went back to Missouri with my grandfather, and at the Big Spring, I found my first land snail. And I was so thrilled. I kept it all summer until it died. Now, if I had moved here at that time, where I have lots of snails, land snails at my place, and I'm near the ocean with plenty of shells, I probably would have died of overstimulus. But I didn't. And so there was a minimal reinforcement to my passion. But I had started to notice these bright, pretty, glittering things flying around my yard, flying over in the park. And one day my stepbrother said, "I'm going to go catch insects for a merit badge. Do you want to come along?" And I said, "Well, I've been kind of intrigued by butterflies. I'll go with you. I'll catch the butterflies." And my stepbrother Bruce quit the next day, but I did not. And I kept going ever since then. That was summer I was 11, 1958. And then something magical happened in 1959. Right around my 12th birthday, my stepmother, same stepmother, had a cabin with her family up in Crested Butte, Colorado. Now I lived by that time in Aurora, Colorado, on the east side of Denver. So my habitat that I could walk to, and it became extraordinarily important to me, was called the Highline Canal. It was an old ditch, a major water conveyance in the late 19th century, early 20th, that conveyed Platte River water out onto the plains east of Denver and kind of serpentines through South Denver and Aurora, out onto the plains near DIA now, the airport. But that was a very important water diversion way back then. It's not important now for water, for the water company, but it is very, very important now as an urban greenway. And that was the first big conservation thing that I got involved in, because I learned my butterflies, got to know them out on the canal. I couldn't get to the mountains easily where there were a lot more butterflies. I'd get to walk out to the plains on my ditch, and it became my magical place. And I wrote one of my earlier books about it called The Thunder Tree, about a big, giant, hollow cottonwood tree that literally saved my life and that of my brother in the great hailstorm of July 24th, I think, 1954, when we were caught in this devastating hailstorm with hail that became the size of pomelos and not bowling balls, but certainly softballs. And that hailstone, that hailstorm ended up killing our kitty cat, wrecking every roof in town, wrecking a lot of cars, and killing 5 cattle by breaking their backs and smashing their heads in the field next to where Tommy and I were playing. But Tommy grabbed me and he hauled me into this hollow tree and covered the opening with his back like the operculum of a snail. And it literally, I'm quite convinced, saved our lives. So that hollow tree became the, we overuse the word icon and iconic these days, but it became the icon of that canal. It became the center of our universe. And that's where I found my butterflies. But you know what? I also saw my first extinctions there, Veronica. My colony of the Olympia marble-winged butterfly, my colony of the silvery blue butterfly, my colony of the bronze copper butterfly, all became extinct through developments while I was a boy growing up there. So I literally watched them go. And it was the Highline Canal and the butterflies that made me a lepidopterist. It was watching those butterflies go that made me a conservationist. And my very first involvement was trying to get my city council to create a greenway and protected habitat on that canal. Now, more than half a century later, I'm thrilled that there's a great big thing called the Canal Conservancy, which is exactly what I called my little effort as a teenager. And they've got thousands of members all around Denver and that big budget, and they're saving the last little bits of the Highline Canal. Now, mind you, there's a lot less left now. They started a little late, but it's really encouraging that that's happening now. And the last I'll say on that question is that I did get to the mountains now and again when my dad would go fishing. And when my stepmother had this cabin up at Crested Butte, it wasn't a fancy ski town then. Crested Butte's kind of like a small Aspen now. But then it was a crusty, dusty old Slavic coal town. And we'd go up there because the cabins were cheap. Her family had one. They would play bridge all day and all night. And my father and I would escape. He'd go out with his fly rod and I with my butterfly net. Now, if Dad had taught me fly fishing, I might have, we might not be here now. We'd all be doing something useful instead. But he didn't. And I got bored with bait plunking. And so I'd go off with my butterfly net. And one of those days, in the summer of 1959, I went over a ridge, came down the other side, and met about 100 people with butterfly nets, or so it seemed at the time. I'd never even seen one. And it was Professor Charles Remington from Yale, Professor Paul Ehrlich of the Population Bomb from Stanford, with their graduate students doing studies on butterflies at the Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory, which was located right there in an old ghost town. I didn't know that was there. Wow. And I came to it by sheer grace of happenstance. Great. Met them, knew their names because I was already a member of the Lepidoptera Society, knew that they were the living gods of Lepidoptera, prostrated myself at their feet. As a kid did once with my first butterfly book, he came up to me, saw me, had the book in his hands, he saw me, he went down on his hands and knees and said, "Emperor." That's the best thing that ever happened to me as a writer. Well, I basically did that with them, and they encouraged me from then on. Every summer, they'd encourage me up there at the laboratory, and I ended up going off and doing my PhD with Dr. Remington many years later. So T-junctions, magical things happening. Yes. Great opportunities that come by serendipity and by choice.
Well, we're thankful about all the serendipities that occurred in your life. We are benefiting from it. And you briefly mentioned how you became to be a writer. When was there like a special moment that when you realized that, I must write to become a whole human being or a person?
Yes, there were two. One of them was entirely practical. And the other one was more perhaps of the aesthetic nature that you're asking, or spiritual. The first one was when I realized that I did better with words in school than I did with numbers. And my butterfly collecting pal across the street, Jack Jeffers, did much better with numbers than he did with words. And it occurred to us we could do each other's busy work, not the tests. We weren't cheating at tests or anything. But as far as all the homework, we had a lot of homework in those days. And we could do each other's busy work. I would write his essays and he would do my math. I mean, we had to learn enough. We had to learn. Yeah, we had to learn enough to pass, and we did okay. But we would do the busy work for each other, and that freed us up and gave us a lot more time for chasing butterflies, and later for chasing girls, I have to say. And so that was, and then I realized after that, hey, I got something going here. Maybe I can use this. And then they started having, then I realized I could get easy B's in classes by writing a little bit better than most of my cohort. And actually it wasn't good writing because I had a biggish vocabulary because of my grandmother, great aunt, mother, and father, who were all readers. My mom and dad didn't finish college because of the Depression, but they were readers. They loved words. My whole family loved words. And so my vocabulary was larger than most of my friends. And I'd use it in classes. And some of my teachers were honest and smart and good enough to say, Bobby, this is not good writing. It's just big writing. You're just showing off. And but other teachers, it would snow them and I'd get easy B's and sometimes an easy A. Fortunately, I learned the right lesson that eventually that it wasn't good writing necessary, but I knew I could write much more easily. And so then they started having contests, Americanism awards, citizenship awards. I remember one essay contest for the Front Range Squadron of the Air Force Academy, all kinds of essay contests in high school that had money for prizes. So I found I could actually make a buck by writing these essays. I didn't perjure myself. I didn't write anything I couldn't get behind, but there weren't things I really felt passionate about. So none of this had anything to do with a passion for writing. It just had to do with exploiting a skill that I had in somewhat greater measure than some others.
Well, I'm glad.
So when that came,
when?
was the summer I graduated. I never wrote a thing in high school that I really felt my heart was in particularly. I even had an essay teacher accused me of plagiarism and really ticked me off. And I thought, I'm never going to write another essay in my life. And I did not plagiarize. Never mind. But the summer I graduated, my mother and brother and I were up in the Colorado Rockies on a butterfly trip. And we were chasing down the butterflies and we got stuck. Oh, how sweet. That was a very sweet kiss. Thank you. And you have a sweet son. And so but we got stuck in an avalanche. We weren't really in the avalanche. It was a big landslide in the summer. There was a lot of rain. It wasn't an avalanche. But it blocked Highway 40. We couldn't get back to Denver, so we had to stay in a mountain lodge overnight, which in itself was a big adventure. That's not something we would go and do, And that afternoon, it was so wet, so brilliantly green in the aspen wood behind the lodge that I walked out there and sucked in the freshness and the damp air and the brilliant Colorado blue columbines shimmering in the raindrops. And that's when it happened. I was moved. I was struck by everything around me in a major visceral way. And I went back to the motels. There was a lodge, a Knotty Pine Lodge. And those whole lodges and motels had stationery. And I opened the desk and there was this beautiful Millsite Lodge stationery with the pine tree on it and pens. And I sat down and I started writing. I wrote everything I felt. And I took it into a kind of a land ethic, very primitive version. It was juvenilia, but it actually stands. I've got a book called Through a Green Lens, 50 Years of Writing for Nature. And that essay starts the book. So, I mean, it's embarrassing. It was childish, but I stand by it. I stand by a few of the words and sentences as decent writing. But I also stand by the ideas. They were very primitive, very simple, nothing particularly original, but they stated my ethic for the first time I ever really felt like writing it. So I included the essay in the book.
The first essay on your Nature Matrix book, the Secrets of the Leaf.
Secrets of the Talking Leaf, yeah.
Yes, I loved it. It had such a profound impact on me.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
But we'll take that conversation off to the side, and I want to make sure I get through the questions, because I think that there's some quite important questions that I want to ask and you respond to. So in 2020, the year of the pandemic and the great fires in the Western states, you have published a couple of books. And I think these publications are timely and pertinent. Please tell us about your books and poems, which were published recently, and share with us what important message that you would like us to remember and take away.
Okay, I surely will. Thank you, Veronica. Yes, I feel guilty because I've actually had a much better plague than a lot of people. I've had a pretty productive year, but it didn't all happen this year. This year gives us a lot of time at home and therefore a lot of time to work if we want to. But these projects were all coming down the pike for a long time. So I am going to mention 3 new books that have just come out, and briefly, and then read tiny bits of them for you, because they encompass kind of what I've tried to do all these years in a writer's life and a conservationist's life. The first one is a book called The Tidewater Reach. It's a field guide to the lower Columbia River in poems and pictures. It's not your standard field guide. We use that term in fun. Got a beautiful print by Debbie McNeely on the cover, but it contains 44 poems of my new ones about the Columbia River, the lower Columbia River, the estuary, the tidal reach, where I live, and gorgeous photographs by my co-author, Judy Vandermaten. There's of the river, of the lower tidal stretch of the Columbia River. Now, there's 2 editions. There's a little more expensive, fancy one with the pictures, a lot of them in color, and then there's a black and white, I call it the People's Edition. It's half the price, but got all the same poems. And the reason I want to read some of this to you in the context of our conversation is that this book is all about focusing in on our own immediate environments, which I think is the key to the future of the species and the planet we inhabit, is an intimate relationship with the world around us, the plants, the animals, and the land that support us. If we don't treat it intimately, if we don't give it intimate attention, we suffer from what I call the extinction of experience. And that's that idea I got from those first butterfly populations I lost in the High Canal. When we lose the common things around us, we tend to become more alienated from nature in general. And then we don't care about the bigger things so much, we don't work for them, and we lose more. It becomes a cycle. So I urge us all to look, and this plague year is a very good time to practice this, to look closely around us and to take all the joys we can in our immediate environment, and right outside the door often, not necessarily in the wilderness area. So I'm going to read 3 poems from the Tidewater Reach that are all about paying close attention around us. And the first one is actually also a poem about books, to honor our book group here today and our love of books and how books can be part of that close attention. But it's also a story. It's a piece of fiction. I wanted to write this story as a novel. I never did. I write fiction. I published a novel recently called Magdalena Mountain, set in Colorado. But I never wrote this as a novel, so I wrote it as a poem instead. It's called The Book Boat. He bought a good old tub named Lorraine, off an old salt gone to shore on Sovey Island. Barely knew navigation, let alone diesel. So come spring and still afloat, he found a mate, a worse off soak, never dried out, in a tavern off Lower Burnside on Water Street. To caulk decks, pump bilge romance the fickle engine to life. When it began to look like Lorraine might not sink, he built shelves in the hold and started buying books wherever he could. Goodwills and thrifts in the Dalles and St. Helens, library sales in Rainier and White Salmon, the remainder tables at Powell's, and then recalling bookmobiles from his boyhood on the plains. He hung up his shingle on the bridge and took the book boat on the road, on the river. And so it went up and down the tidal reach, Bonneville to Baker Bay and back again, sometimes through the locks, all the way to Lewiston, laying his wares before the boaters, the fishers, the workers, the loafers, all of them hungry for good books, though they might not know it. He sold them cheap, gave them away, or his favorite, bartered for fish, fruit, or laundry, swapped a late Brian Doyle for a sturgeon, Middlemarch for Maryhill wine, made enough for ground beef, beer, and diesel. Even the cat got fed, and the mate paid enough for drunken leave ashore. Lorraine became a legend up and down the river. Marinas vied for her, gave free moorage for a night or three, until he started to wonder about the islands, the inside passage, and beyond. So he took Lorraine across the Columbia River bar and didn't die. Put in at La Push, where he sold all of his pushkins to a Russian emigre, and a set of Twilight to a wannabe werewolf. And then east up the straits, Nia Bay, CQ, Port Angeles, Port Townsend, and points north. Last rumors came from Kodiak. But even now, the Columbia remembers, and there's always a slip open, just in case. So that honors the books that we all love. The second one I wanted to read, of course, my bookmark fell out, so give me just a second. Do you ever have that problem? My bookmarks always fall out during readings. But the
No, we aren't any. No. Which side of the river do you live on?
I live on the Washington side. Thank you. I live in a little tiny village called Grays River, which is on not even on most maps, but it's about 35 miles east of the coast, and I'm close to Astoria, Oregon. So my girlfriend lives in Astoria, across the 4-mile bridge across the mouth of the Columbia. So I'm on the Washington side, but I spend time on the Oregon side too.
Good.
And this one is about the little town at the very base, the very end of the Columbia River, where Lewis and Clark came, where Captain Gray came. Captain Gray came in 1792 before Vancouver, Gray of Gray's River, Gray's Harbor. And if he hadn't, I'd have national health insurance now because Washington and Oregon be part of Canada. But Captain Gray beat Vancouver by a few days. And in the place where Lewis and Clark hit the water arose a little village called Ilwaco. And that's where this poem takes place. It's called, and it honors books too, because there's a bookstore in it that plays a big role. It's called I Cover the Waterfront, Ilwaco, December 2018. Sometimes it seems the hopes of all mankind. Oh, this is a Christmas poem too. Sometimes it seems the hopes of all mankind lie on display in a small town bookstore, against all odds still open on a bleak December dock, in a time when so much else is going, gone. After the reading, I spill out the back door onto the wet green waterfront, walk up and down in the dripping dusk. The slips still have boats, and though the fleet is tiny now, still a good seafood grill, a pub, and Jesse's Fish Market at the end of the pier persist. I remember charters by the dozen, the cafe at the end of the spit, DuPay's Hardware is a going concern, but now it's mostly a matter of the riverfront, where the Columbia brushes Baker Bay before dying or being born again into the ocean itself. And what moves me is not what's gone, but what somehow remains. The boats, the oysters, the books, shiny in the light through the wet window. They speak to the possibility of all things, even in these times, waterfronts do. As long as little seaside towns live on, giving harbor to half-forgotten craft and vagabonds on a winter's night, I will continue to cover the waterfront, seeking something not likely to be found anywhere else. I think that speaks to these times too, during the plague, when we all are suffering disassociation. We need to remember the close association with our communities and anticipate a time when we can really get out and be part of them again.
Yes.
Do I have time for one more plus a little bit from Matrix?
Yes.
Okay, one more short one that's actually dear to me. And it is all one sentence. And yet I think you'll find this grammatical. But it's all about movement. It's about movement in nature. And therefore I didn't want to stop it. It's called, and it's about what another sensibility besides our own might perceive out there. Always worth considering from time to time. It's called What the Muskrat Saw. Takes me back to the first books I read, which were my Thornton Burgess bedtime stories. Johnny Muskrat's Tale, Paddy the Beaver, Chatterer the Red Squirrel, and those. What the Muskrat Saw. Slipping through the marsh beneath the striders as the beaver, 10 times his size, slid through the pond beside the dam where the aspen lay akimbo, stripped of bark above the runnel where the rainbow rose to meet the hatch of caddis at the riffle of the kingfisher's rattle, through the willow's shadow on the river where the cottonwood leaf floated over sandy bottoms scored with crayfish holes and rocks all coated with snails, whose tentacles quivered at the passage of the blennies and the scissor of the heron's bill, which came up empty for a change because the mink disturbed the fish a moment early, and they in turn alarmed a frog that leapt upon a fallen log where otter sunned before returning upstream to the marsh where the muskrat, slipping underneath the striders, saw him and rose into his reedy house.
Are there any commas in that sentence?
Yes, there are commas. Well, let's see, maybe there are not. No, yes, there's a couple of commas, and there are the line breaks in poems matter. So the line breaks provide small pauses, but otherwise just a whole bunch of dependent clauses. So,
Thank you so much for that. And I'm going to open up the questions from the audience.
Right.
So anybody who has questions, please feel free.
I have a question about the monarch butterfly, which I heard within the last day or so is dying off badly, but cannot be considered a endangered species by the federal government. What's that all about?
Now you get to see that even though I got my pretty shirt on, I've got my sweatpants on too, like everybody else. I'm a good person to ask on that, except for the fact that I'll talk too long because I've been involved in monarchs for over half a century. But I'll give you a very, very brief answer as I can. I really got involved in butterfly conservation over 50 years ago, and in '71 founded the Xerces Society, named after the extinct Xerces blue butterfly, to work on it, on endangered wise. Now there's 55 staff in 5 states working on all kinds of endangered insect issues, but the monarchs were a big part of their project. Now, way back in '76, I got the monarch dedicated as the top priority in world butterfly conservation, and people have been trying by IUCN, and people have been trying to conserve it ever since, but we haven't necessarily known what to do, and we've had big odds with the overlogging in the monarch forests in Mexico, which has caused a big decline in the continental population that migrates to Mexico. That logging, they're getting a handle on that now, and it is reduced. But the biggest problem with the major part of the population in the north, when it comes north in the summer, is the Roundup Ready soybeans and corn that have been created through Monsanto's genetic crop products. And that's caused a huge amount of glyphosate to be used in the Midwest, much more than ever before. And that's killed a massive amount of the milkweed available to monarchs. So between the genetically modified crops in the north and the logging in Mexico and climate change, which is pushing the monarchs into smaller areas because they need the moisture and the coolness in the wintertime to get through the winter, all those factors have reduced their numbers by at least 70%. So the numbers are way, way down in Mexico in the wintertime now, although the last 3 winters have been slightly up from what they were a little bit before because the summers have been more favorable here. But now the West Coast monarchs are even worse off. They're the ones that breed in Washington and Idaho and Oregon and the mountains of California and migrate down to the California coast. You may have seen them at Pismo Beach or yes, and a lot of people have seen them at Santa Cruz or Pacific Grove or Santa Barbara. Those are down, and a dear friend of mine conducts the Thanksgiving counts for those every year or manages them, and their numbers are just out, and their numbers are down more than 99% over what they were in the 80s and 90s. And we're not quite sure what's going on in California. Sometimes it's development on the coast. Sometimes it's directly the fires, but not that many times, whether it's a combination of drought and again, pesticides and the milkweeds, the loss of milkweed. So between them all, they're in terrible shape. Lots of people working on it, and were petitioned for listing. The petition, the study has been going on for 3 years to see whether they should be listed. And the announcement came down yesterday. And they said, as you say, John, they said, warranted. They determined that it was warranted for listing, not because the monarch is extinct, as in danger of extinction as a species, because it does occur in some other places in a non-migratory way, but the migratory phenomenon of the North American monarch, which is the grandest insect spectacle in the world, one of the greatest migrations, is definitely in danger. And the administration ruled, yes, they warrant listing. But they're not going to do it because they're not willing to expend the resources on this species at this time. And so it's going to have to come back for review every year. And all I can say is I will not get into politics except to say that many people have hope that conservation will be a higher priority in the coming administration. I'm waiting to see who's going to be the Secretary of the Interior, which will be very important in this. And if we take endangered species a little more seriously, then perhaps in the next review period, we can actually get it listed. But it's very important that they did rule that it is warranted for listing. And that actually is that didn't come out in the news stories. It's very much about how important that is. But if you go to the Xerces website, xerces.org, xerces.org, and read their press release about what came out yesterday, you'll get the details and the positive side of it, which is that at least they've admitted that listing is warranted. And I'll also add that I've got a book that I'll recommend to you that I wrote called Chasing Monarchs. It's now in print from Yale University Press, Migrating with the Butterflies of Passage. In the year 2008, I followed the monarch migration all the way from the north to the south and wrote my adventures along the way. So it's a travelogue. I hope it reads like a novel, but it tells the natural history of monarchs along the way. Very, very important thing. And I guess we're making some progress, but we're at a very perilous state with them right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Can I plant milkweed in my garden? Is that the good thing to do?
Well, a lot of people are planting milkweed, but the problem is this. Where do you live, John?
I live in the San Francisco area.
Okay, yes, by all means, but the thing is, what a lot of people are doing is planting tropical milkweed because it's easy to buy and easy to grow, and it'll grow much farther north than the tropics. But it means that there's milkweed there all year round, and that is stopping the monarchs on their migration and keeping them from continuing, and it's causing them to overwinter in places where they're probably going to die. So don't plant tropical milkweed, plant the native species and do everything you can for the native milkweeds where they're supposed to grow. Yes, that's a very important thing.
Thank you very much.
I have a next thing. It's not a question, but I wanted to share a quick photos show that Dr. Gordon shared with us. I thought people would appreciate it. Can everyone see? Look at this beautiful butterfly.
And that's a monarch. That's a male monarch.
I thought John would appreciate, and then Bruce.
You can tell it's a male by the dots on the wings.
And look at this. Look at how beautiful.
Now we think of pandas on bamboo, but when Tia, my late wife Tia, and I went up and hiked into a wilderness in China in 2012 to see the pandas and other things, she photographed this gorgeous bamboo feeding butterfly with purple forewings and this beautiful pattern underneath. It's on a bamboo, and bamboo is the food plant for that butterfly, as well as the pandas in the same place. And that's a little green airstreak. Have you ever thought butterflies might look like that? That lives right here in Washington State, and its name is its scientific name is Washingtonia. So it's a pretty good Washington butterfly being green like that.
Wow. So you need to explain this one.
I put that in there for the movie and for my book. If you don't know my book, that Where Bigfoot Walks is the book the movie is based on.
Right.
I did have a Guggenheim fellowship actually. In the movie, it's to study butterflies, but in real life, my Guggenheim was to study Bigfoot. Believe it or not, that's pretty amazing. That's the most amazing thing of all. If Bigfoot walked in here and started feeding you bonbons right now, Veronica, that would not be as strange as me getting a Guggenheim to study and write about Bigfoot. But I did, and I wrote.
All right, this one. You need to explain this one.
That's where I am Bigfoot. Yeah, that's the Green Man. A big storm brought down a giant oak branch over my driveway, and cutting it up so we could get out of the driveway, this big mat of moss came off. I later transplanted it to another log where it thrives today. But before I did, Tia said, "We can't waste that. Put it on." So that's the Green Man.
That's awesome.
Yeah, that's
Okay,
how I.
this one, you and David Cross.
Correct. It's David Cross who portrayed me in the movie. He looks more like Allen Ginsberg than like me, but we both have white beards, and he's a lot fitter and younger, and he was able to do that very, very physically demanding job that movie required. If you heard the talk with Tom Putnam, you'll know that it was a tough movie to make. People got hurt, including David. But I was honored to have him play me. Very, very funny man. And I have to say, he plays me as a doofus in the woods. He goes into the woods knowing nothing, and he's naive about natural history. He keeps getting in trouble. But that was necessary for the narrative because the character's got to have room to grow, right? And to develop. Also, we needed some comic relief in the movie because it also deals with Tia's cancer and her death. So it's fine. I laugh along with the Bob as doofus part, but in real life, I'm a fairly good woodsman.
All right, thank you. That was my
Aren't
question.
you going to show the one of Deborah?
No, I don't have that one actually.
Oh, I thought I sent you that one last night. That's a sweet picture of Deborah and me. Okay.
And Dave had a question. I saw your hand come up. Mhm.
Yeah, actually, you've addressed one of the questions I had, which was, were you really that much of a doofus in the woods?
No, I wasn't.
As an experienced backpacker, I was terrified by a lot of the scenes in that movie because basically, if it had really been literally that way, you would have been very lucky to get out alive.
There were a couple places I was lucky to get out alive. I did. The scene of almost falling over the cliff was real. Yeah. Except that it wasn't quite that kind of a cliff. It was a very, very steep slope and I almost went over backwards with my backpack because of a butterfly. That was a near lethal time. A couple of the other times I was in real physical danger, as David portrays, but not quite through as much naivete on his part. No, I'm a pretty good backpacker.
Casually walking around in that stony cave in your underwear, I assume that was a bit of an exaggeration. So I did have another question. I loved, by the way, the scene where you said that you had a Guggenheim and the person you were talking to thought you were threatening him with something like a glove.
I know.
That was hilarious. But
It's a funny
you
movie.
mentioned glyphosate earlier, and that's of course become quite a controversial hot button. Now, one of the obvious things, since it's a herbicide, is that if you use it on the wrong herb, if the weed that you use it on is milkweed, then you're going to kill something that maybe you shouldn't be killing.
That's right.
The other thing, though, that has gotten all sort of convolved with that is the idea that we should worry that it's going to give us all cancer. And those two things seem to have gotten all wrapped around each other. I wonder if you'd like to shed any light on your views about glyphosate.
Yes, thank you, Dave. I'm trained as a scientist, and so I try to keep my skepticism where it belongs and look for evidence for allegations. It's awfully hard to prove allegations about chemicals. I know that, but it's because we took it too cavalierly and did not practice the precautionary principle that a great many cancer swarms have come about from different chemicals, not to mention birds and their eggshells with DDT and so on and so forth. Glyphosate is one that is particularly insidious because Monsanto has always represented it as being a safe and stable salt. And people use it in Roundup all the time without even the most basic precautions. I see young people on campuses employed by the grounds crews to spray glyphosate on weeds on lawns where other students are going to be basking and lying in the sun and making out and so on, picnicking. And then the kids spraying it aren't wearing protective gear. And there's been Swedish research for decades, but lately a lot more research in the US and elsewhere showing a definite cancer link with glyphosate. In fact, there have been a bunch of settlements of class action for users of Roundup who have actually been awarded some major settlements. And yet Roundup is still readily available. Glyphosate is used in vast quantities. And these Roundup ready soy and corn seeds virtually require the farmers to use them. So they're buying into these expensive seeds and then into these expensive chemicals. They're threatening themselves. There's a lot of cancer in the farming communities, and it kills the milkweed too. So I don't know where we go from that. Also the neonics, the neonicotinoid group of pesticides are, as we know, horrifically damaging to bees. There's the big bumblebee die-offs and very bad on honeybees and a lot of native bees. Xerces is doing a lot of work on that. And Europe banned neonics for a while and they're reconsidering it. But the neonics are so widely employed in agriculture, it's hard to buy plants at a plant market without getting them that's pre-treated with neonics. And the neonic is systemic. It goes into all the tissues. So it's in the pollen, the nectar, the leaves, and everything. These are real problems. I think in a new age, we have to take a more serious attitude toward the poisons to which we expose ourselves and the rest of nature.
Thank you, Dr. Pyle. We're running out of time, unfortunately, and thank you very much for being here today. This was enlightening and inspirational as your books are. And I hope that our paths will cross again, and we would love to invite you back for more discussion around conservation.
Next month.
What's that, Bruce?
Thank you.
Next month.
Next month.
Next
Let me
month.
just say very quickly that the two books we're going to talk about next month are Sky Time and Gray's River,
Yep.
coming out in a new edition, and
Yep.
Nature Matrix. And whereas the poems and Sky Time take a close look right at where we are every day,
Yeah.
Nature Matrix takes a broad look outward at the whole thing. So please come back and join us next month.
Thank you,
Excellent.
Dr. Pyle. Thank you
Yeah.
so
Thank you for having
much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
That was wonderful.
Thank you, Veronica. Thank you.
And merry holidays to you. May you all have a delightful winter revels of however you practice them.
We will.
Spending
Thank
your
you.
loved ones as you
Thank
can
you.
carefully be with.